What's up, everybody? This is Zach with the M Weekly. I'm back with some more cool technology, and I'm joined by James Neufeld from Samdesk. James, thank you for joining me.
Hey, Zach. Good to be here, man.
So the reason I am super excited about having Samdesk and James here is that they are one of the companies that has sort of been on my radar for a really long time, and they're doing some really innovative stuff, specifically around real-time monitoring, that sort of intelligence augmentation using AI and software. And the reason that I get excited about this stuff is that it is so hard to sort of sort through all of the noise of the internet and social media and media reports and all of this stuff that you guys are taking in and that we're doing, as emergency managers, public safety personnel, intelligence analysts. We're doing essentially with our brains and trying to synthesize that into something useful. But I think first and foremost, I kind of want to get your background and figure out, how did you get to this point? Because you're a founder and the CEO of the company. So you were here from day one. So how'd you get here?
Yeah, awesome. Well, good to be here, Zach. Excited to kind of get into all of it. My background is more on the broadcast and journalism side. So most of my career, even going back to community radio, very rural kind of parts of Canada, building up radio stations, and later in my career, helping newsrooms predominantly. Build out their technologies and systems. And so I was very fortunate, and I kind of have like a front row seat to a huge evolution in that industry, and learned so many parallels that I'll talk about, and kind of, how that dovetails with emergency managers. Sure. From the flow of information, how to source information, and how we all rely on information, especially during a crisis. But for me, I had the good fortune of, kind of traveling the world, helping newsrooms build out their infrastructure. And for me, it was really, I've kind of been watching it for a while. I was the new kid, just kind of, just starting my career. I thought everything that I saw could be done better. Why are we doing it this old fashioned way? So very challenger mindset to begin with. I'm sure I was a pleasure for all my previous bosses to have on the team.
First off, as someone who's exactly like that, who has irritated bosses and gone behind their backs to make things faster and more efficient, I'm already a huge fan, and you've won me over because I hate status quo. I'm so tired of it. So,
yeah. Well, now that I'm a boss, I'll apologize to all my other bosses for how.
Okay, now you've seen the other side. I get it.
Now I'm on the other side, like fall in line. So yeah, for me it was like it was 2011, right? And we had just finished. TV2 Denmark had just finished installing, a really state-of-the-art facility. We were there as a vendor, just kind of observing, and it's Scandinavian and all its glory of like high-tech facilities, top-of-the-art facilities, great architecture, great everything, and all this money into information gathering and kind of news production. And the earthquakes happened just off of Japan at that time, and so for me, right, I was like, this is crazy. We're spending so many millions of dollars getting this facility up, and then it's kind of that in the newsroom, it's that lull, right? Okay, we knew what had happened, but we couldn't cover the story yet. So there's a major natural disaster. We had people on planes, we had flight crews, we were trying to get on the ground, we're talking to partners, trying to talk to, the news wires that were trying to desperately get to the ground to actually cover the event. So we knew it was happening, but we couldn't really cover it to the degree that we wanted to after spending all this money on state-of-the-art facilities. And, in the broadcast days, you're lucky to get to the air in hours, sometimes it's 12, sometimes even further before. I mean, if you want to get your correspondent on the ground to, give live reporting for your audience in your language, you're talking 24 to 48 hours and you've done well.
Yeah.
And so, this major, catastrophe is unfolding and you've got nothing to go to air with. You're just like, well, it's happening. Our audience is waiting. And I'm sure you can see all the parallels to emergency management now. Where they
absolutely.
Kind of have the similar thing.
So I actually have a broadcast background as well. I've worked for PBS.
Okay, cool.
So I do have a sense of like, there's that moment of something has occurred and this is where that vacuum is, right? And that vacuum gets filled with nonsense, misinformation, disinformation, bad information. And as a newscaster, especially in 2011 when traditional media was, still king for a lot of this type of stuff, sitting there and just being like, I have to talk through this. Like, I have this much information. I mean, the
Yeah.
painful analysis of the Japan earthquake, Katrina, 9/11, of just, watching these newscasters sort of like shamelessly make stuff up because they want to do their job,
Yeah.
but like, you don't have the information. So you kind of just have to be like, I guess I'm going to take the little bit that I have, and that little grain, I'm going to grow into something.
And we'll loop it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Oh man, 100%. Right. And so, for those of us that were in the newsroom, right? So what I observed, and, I was there myself, we all just logged onto Twitter. Right.
Yeah.
So like that was the like, oh man, okay. So this is upside down now. Now it's becoming clear to me that we're spending a lot of money and the coverage isn't there. The information isn't there. Plus the cost benefit analysis isn't there. I looked at the newsroom across the board. I mean, there's hundreds of people hitting refresh on Twitter. Right.
Yeah. Right.
That's the information source. And so that's really, that's going way back far. And I didn't, that's kind of where the original idea came from. I wish I'd say that I got started on it right away. It took a couple of years before we got it off the ground, but that was kind of like, I think kind of the nucleus, right? We're like, this is just backwards. And every newsroom I went to is the same thing, right? You go, spend time with the New York Times, through CNN to BBC, any newsroom you would go to. What a lot of people didn't talk about is the most prevalent tool you saw everywhere was Twitter. That was just the de facto news wire now, right? If you were a journalist and you wanted to catch an edge, that's how you did it. Still how a lot of them do it, right? We know this. And so, but it was extremely laborious, right? And so it had within it, right, this promise of raw information. So in Fukushima, we were seeing firsthand reports of all this sort of stuff happening, the floodwaters, the dams breaking. We were actually getting visual assessment data of the infrastructure damage. We were seeing where people were being stuck. Like you just had to look at it for like 5 minutes, and you already had so much more information of the severity of the situation that even if you had a journalist on the ground or even somebody there, they would give a single perspective, right?
Sure, yeah.
So it's just like overwhelming, right? You're like, and now we're like laughing at it in hindsight, like this is so obvious, but that was at the time, that was novel. And so yeah, that was it. Any newsroom we went to, that was the case. And so the first version of Samdesk was actually a breaking news tool dedicated purely for journalists. That's kind of where we got our start.
Oh, that's so cool.
And we're like, man, it just relies so much on luck, right? The common denominator between, a really good breaking newsroom and what they could really do with that was how many people they had. You had more people, they're hitting more refresh, more topics. You had linguistic experts, area experts. You just broadened your chances of maybe getting a story first or being able to cover it first. And so we're like, okay, let's take that and start building an AI. And that was kind of like the first version of Samdesk. Can we build an AI that really thinks like a journalist? And which, we'll talk about a second of how Samdesk differentiates ourselves today. But a lot of it comes back to, the W's that we have in journalism, what's happening, where's it happening, why, who, all that sort of stuff. And so we started at the early days of Samdesk, starting to build, AI models that thought like a journalist. So our what classifier could, we spent a lot of time in the early days understanding, this social media post is talking about an active shooter. This social media post is talking about shots on net. So they both have the keyword, shots. And if you're on Twitter, you have to still sift through, and you have to use human intelligence to understand the differences. And that's one of the areas that AI is really good at. It's really good at, pattern recognition. And if you give it a large enough data set, and you can start to recognize and predict, to say, this is actually a social media post about a live ongoing crisis that's happening right now. This is a sports reference. And so,
I have a funny story about that, actually. So one of your competitors, not Samdesk, actually, I don't even know if it would be considered a competitor. It was a similar system navigating. So I was an emergency manager at a higher ed institution. And I've always been a geek, right? I want to get in on the technology early. I want to learn this stuff. And I'm trying to always figure out, how do I do my job better? And I know technology helps in a lot of ways. So this platform was presented to me, and I was like, this is great, because I'm, when the Boston Marathon bombing occurred, I was the duty officer for the state of Vermont. And I found out about it through my brother, who's like, go on Twitter, something's going on in Boston. And I actually ran down the hall to our state police commander, and I was like, hey, just, this is going on. You guys might want to start spinning up, because they're going to be calling for help pretty quick here. That was like the early days. So now a few years later, I'm a higher ed institution emergency manager. And they're like, yeah, that's actually really cool. We have this system that we use, through our police services, and we, we'll give you access to it. Well, our campus radio station was in that sphere of monitoring, as far as the geolocated tweets and everything else. And so, yeah, every time a Cypress Hill song, here's something you can't understand. Oh, I could just kill a man. They're like posting lyrics and clips from the songs, and they've got a running playlist. And it's like, I'm getting alerts constantly. And what I did was turn it off. I was like, I am a better analyst than this system is, and I'm just going to do it myself. I'll set up my keyword search. And, it's amazing how far it's come since then, obviously. But yeah.
Just to nerd out on that a little bit, right? Remember like in the early days on TweetDeck where you had like, exclude this term, but you want this, and you would like look at people's
formulas, huge formulas. Like it was like, yes, it was these terms. And then within 5 nautical miles of this, lat long. And I had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I'm tracking, I'm up in Vermont. So I've got like a VTWX, hashtag. And then there was a group of emergency managers who were, it was like there was VOSTs that were standing up, the virtual operations support teams, all these groups that are trying to figure out, what do we use social media for? I proudly say I'm the first public safety person in the state of Vermont to set up a Twitter and I think maybe Facebook account. I don't know if I can say I had the Facebook account, but the first Twitter account specifically designed for getting information out and back from out there. And man, when I first started doing that, people were like, it's nuts. There's nothing but trash on there. Yeah. And they weren't wrong. There was a lot it was a Wild West for sure. But oh man, that's so funny. The TweetDeck thing, it just screens just eating up my CPU trying to figure this stuff out.
Just struggling to keep along. I love it. That's where we spent so much time in the newsroom before we got into that space too. And I would just be like, oh, we'd be sharing that stuff so often. Like, oh, what's your, share me your search parameters. Yeah. And so we'd have like an exclude, like, oh, that's a good one. Let's exclude this one. Let's include this one. So we were like sharing just our TweetDeck search parameters. Yeah. But like on the Samdesk journey, right? Like that actually became a really important lesson for us on, what you were doing, what a lot of journalists were doing, a lot of folks were doing at that time, right? Those were actually kind of like the seed sets for a good AI model. Yeah. And so what we were able to do is like really learn from our users and really understand like, oh, okay, that's noise. You don't want that because that's noise. You do want this because that's signal. And you started to spend all this time with these people that had these setups, and you couldn't ask for a better, kind of test bed to actually understand how to build an AI model. And that's the part that we couldn't, that's where I think people struggle to scale in the early days, right, Zach? It was like, oh, sure, let me set up a keyword parameter. And we saw so many case studies about like, oh, here's how we tracked, the Boston Marathon through Twitter. And it was so easy to do in a retrospective, marketing campaign. Everybody can always look back and say, oh, here's the Hudson Miracle. I'm like, yeah, well, we know that now. We can look back on Twitter and we can pinpoint that thing. If you're an emergency manager, first responder, or whatever kind of, analyst you are now, you know that like when you're in the hot seat, it's very different. You need to have signal, 99% of the time. Your tolerance for noise and configuration just doesn't exist. And so we all knew the promise of these things, and we all kind of saw a firsthand, account of it all, right? So that's Samdesk V1, right, Zach? Is like, how do we solve that? How do we just get rid of the noise problem? And it took us a couple years, right?
We'll be right back after this quick break for ads. The L3 Harris Extreme 400p radio solves problems and is specifically designed for emergency services. How do we know? We field tested it with medical, urban search and rescue, and collapse and confined structures. This radio is amazingly tough. Check out the L3 Harris Extreme 400p radio at l3harris.com right now. How do you spell Doberman Emergency Management? EOP, OEP, HVA, HMP, Thyra, TTX, Drone, PDA. Whenever you need an expert, Doberman Emergency Management field experts are there for support. Contact an expert at DobermanEMG.com today.
Actual time frame, like when was the V1 sort of formulated? Because one thing that I think you guys were very early on where others were sort of like trying to figure it out is that AI component, and like not just AI to capture, but like you said, AI to boost the signal and actually start to ensure that this stuff is real. And I think that set you apart back then. But like AI wasn't a thing that was in the common vernacular like it is in the last couple of years.
No, it's funny. We talk about that now too. We have customers are like, are using large language models and they're using certain vernacular now. We're like, well, it's just a scale of your seed set, right? I mean, they're getting really large now. So LLMs are absolutely a thing, right? But it's funny, Twitter and those of us that were kind of using real-time data sets in the early days always had an extremely large data set. And it happened to be real time. But the terms change. Yeah. So we were pretty, under wraps for about 3 years, Zach, before we kind of really came out. And we were in hindsight trying to solve a really hard problem that I think if we had known how hard it was, we probably wouldn't have gotten started. One of those classic stories. And, not least of which we were selling to journalists, which are just, I'm friends with a million journalists and,
of course,
and they're very close, but they're a difficult bunch. Very hard to.
I mean, anything that you're feeding them, it's their reputation. You have a industry that is built on relationships, really, right? Like that's how you got your breaking news story was the cop, the beat cop that knows them or the fire chief that knows them is like, hey, heads up, we're going to this huge fire. You may want to get down there, or completely the opposite where like they burned every bridge and now they're like relying on stringers and sketchy, side hustles to get to the scene and stuff. And it was never really sort of technology driven. It's always been the boots on the ground sort of like, digging for that information. So to trust technology, particularly novel technology that, not just from the Twitter perspective, but from your competitors and other folks that are trying to do it where they're like, this is the solution. And then you get it. And it's like all the college radio station, noise that's coming out there with the explicit, playlists that are coming out or whatever. So,
well, totally. Right. And so we got that off the ground in the early days. And then, some of the early feedback was like, well, that's great. I'm really worried about international problems. And we had to like repeat the problem. I mean, like the engineering teams would, there'd be pop culture songs in French that we had no idea with that would be messing with our models. Or we had people then too that would like live tweet, television shows, right? As a play-by-play. It's like, good luck trying to build an AI model in real time to be like, no, this is this TV show Cops. This is not a live pursuit now in a different language that you don't understand. And so the engineering team at Samdesk did an amazing job. But that we knew that we had to kind of solve those things, right? So you had to get the what model right. You had to get the where model right. You had to get, the credibility, which will come on in a bit from our verification standards as well for the disinfo problem, right? But it was like every layer of these kind of the stack had to, in of itself, I think was a huge problem, just getting the what classifier right. Yeah. But then for us, we spent, so much time getting the where component correct too, right? You have the Springfield problem, as they say. It's like, okay, so great. You've built an AI model that can say, this is a real shooting. This is not a real shooting. This is, a real fire, not a real fire, but it's happening on Main Street in Springfield. And, for any of our users today, we can provide them precise, this is what's happening. If you don't give them the information of where it's happening, you may as well not send them the alert either, right? Because they need to know exactly where it's happening and you can't have that. So I'll spare the details and we kind of move on in the story. But, for us, it's kind of solving a lot of those hard problems to really, we kind of thought from the early days, Zach, that we had to get the signal to noise ratio dialed in before this is going to really take off, because it's just going to be another noisy tool that you're going to need lots of analysts or professionals to use and further refine. And that's not really like a leapfrog in technology. That's just an iterative process. That's like a slightly better tweet deck. It's not really like, hey, I've got your back. I'm analyzing this behind the scenes for you guys. And when something hits a certain threshold of confidence, accuracy, then I'll let you know, right? And so for the Samdesk journey, to kind of, make a longer story short, what we didn't really know, and we're new kids on the kind of block now when it comes to the emergency management space. And so cool to be hearing from so many of our customers in that space. And we're learning a lot in that area now. But what we saw in the early days, Zach, was, probably people like you that were trying to get TweetDeck to work, whether it's a fusion center, first responder, a corporate security function, some sort of agency, they're all doing the same thing. They had rooms and rooms full of people trying to get an edge. They're hitting refresh. And we honestly thought, as an outsider, like your Boston Marathon story, we always, and still to this day, we can share some stories about that now. We're probably in a disbelief that emergency managers didn't already know. We're like, those are the guys that should know this, right? Even we're now in the defense space and we can talk to some stories about that sort of stuff. We're like, no, you guys have SIGINT, human, you've got a lot of resources. You should know this. And there's a lot they know. And I think OSINT is an addition to, it's not a replacement. And we can talk about that. But that component was like, you're calling in, like something happened in the Boston Marathon. You're seeing stuff on Twitter. It hasn't even gotten all the way up the chain yet. Like, you're just finding out when the people on the ground are finding out, and you're the one that's supposed to respond to this. And you don't even know right?
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean,
and-
you're always behind the 8 ball. And, I think, in any, of course, like your goal is, at least in emergency management, prevention and mitigation first, let's try to hem it off, but it's bad stuff is going to happen. And so closing that gap from the notification to the response to the recovery is critical. That's what saves lives. And in many cases, especially in emergency management, it's getting out that first alert, right? Sending the mass notification that says there's a huge explosion here, and the confidence level to do that in a large community where you could be potentially impacting businesses, shutting down roads, causing mass hysteria, it's really tough. It's really hard to get people to push the button, honestly. And so you create this like self-fulfilling, prophecy where, I have all this information that's saying this is occurring, but like maybe I'm not tech savvy, and sure, I have the system, but I don't have confidence in it. Or someone does trust, one of those systems, and they rely on it and they do something, and that decision blows up in their face. Now, most people, if you do it, again, like I would say the worst outcome is always not doing something. And that was true versus like, hey, we acted in our best interest of our community. There's a lot of information there to make that decision. But again, that was the early days. Like if I were to walk up to, I was just telling the police chief, hey, it was the commander of the state police, hey, this is just a heads up. Like, I don't know if this is true. I'm seeing this. I think, based on what I'm seeing, it's accurate. You might want to reach out to your counterparts. It's very different from what the capacity is today, which is pretty trustworthy, that the technology is not lying to you, that the resources are accurate, that it's probably vetted through so many processes now versus those early days that you can. However, that's where like this education piece and getting people to understand, how did you get there? Like this isn't some fly by night operation. You've been working at this now for over a decade. It evolves. And so I guess like, as you are seeing this, so we're kind of like at the point, I think, where you realize you have a platform that's working really well for the news service, or like people that want to be on the inside of this, left of, not quite right of the boom. You want to be right at boom. And obviously now you're starting to allude to the fact that you guys are recognizing there might be a public, safety or public service component, as well as, private sector folks like a GSOC or someone who, wants to take care of their employees, help safeguard their businesses and stuff. So I'm guessing that's the next transition as you're starting to move 100%.
There. It is. So like, as we kind of like in the last 5 years got our eyes open to that world, right? So every kind of GSOC, SOC, NOC, whatever you want to call it, right? They had rooms full of people, and what they were doing is they had CNN on the big screen. They had the local news. And we're like, well, hey, like guys, we actually know before those guys, or in most cases, we're the ones that
using your software.
You're so downstream here. You're waiting for those guys to do their work. Don't you want to get to work verifying and kind of getting to work and triaging these things at point, at kind of the nucleus, right? So that was kind of the turning point for us at Samdesk, where things started to get really, really busy for us as a company. And we're so humbled to serve, so many different, parts of that industry that we're learning so much about. So today, humbled to serve, fusion centers, first responders, defense entities, here and abroad and allied nations, a lot of within the corporate security functions, so travel, risk management functions that are relying on Samdesk, and the whole gambit, right, of just where, it's almost any industry, right? I mean, we, information is just, it's so, critically important these days because the world is changing faster. And so I think, when we talked about, the classic thing of left to bang, or, is getting as close to bang as possible. when we talk to corporations and governments, and that's kind of like a common request they want to have, you want to get ahead of it. And that's good. And there's a lot of great companies that are working on that. And where we can, we do help that. But every time that every fusion center or what have you, Zach, that we go to and spend time with is we're like, well, hey, that's cool. Left of bang, it's important. And you should look into that. You're so far after bang. I don't even know why you're thinking about left of bang right now, because we got to talk realistically how we shorten this gap to respond. Right.
Yeah.
And so what we talk about is the efficacy of all your planning. You can't, all your planning erodes, exponentially with every minute, after bang that this happens. Your windows and optionality are closing so fast all the time, right?
Yeah.
And that's the promise, I think, of like OSINT, and this is just one data source. Now it's hundreds of thousands of data sources, and
right.
IoT. There's so many things that are plugging it in that get to the accuracy that you're talking about. So it's not just a single data feed coming in. It's looking at all data feeds in parallel to look at weather patterns, traffic patterns, social media. Like, things will tell you that, very clearly from the holistic data approach versus just a singular data approach.
Yeah.
But, back to that point, right? I mean, that's kind of the, I don't know if the comical bit is, if that's fair to say that way, but, that gap is still so big. It's so big. And that's where we spend a lot of time talking to our customers. And we're like, you guys are trying to get left of bang and you're like hours or days after bang. And the reality is you still probably don't respond for most of us. I mean, there's some 3-lettered agencies that are working in different realms that, we may never fully understand the work that they do, but for the vast majority of us, right, this is left of, we are right of bang. Sorry. We only start to go to work, right? When something's happened, right? And so that's the part that blew our mind back to kind of, your Boston Marathon story, right? It's like, so one story we have is we've got, a major, allied, international defense agency that we work with very, very closely. And so the situation is there's a missile that we've detected from, various different kind of data signals that we have. It's coming from Russia towards Poland. We were able to pick it up in the system, look at a couple different data sources, identify the credibility, the veracity of where this is happening. And of course, it happens to land in Polish, territory. And so the pre and post for this customer is when that was happening before Samdesk, mass hysteria. Is this an aggression? Is this an escalation? What is
World War III about to kick off?
There are
Article 5 is being implemented today.
The stakes don't get much higher than this. Yeah. And so, pre Samdesk, what they told us is, right, so they would call a press conference. They would have a barrage of journalists like inbound, is this, what are you going to do about this? World leaders need to respond. Everybody needs to be aware of the situation, but nobody knows. Again, they're so focused on left of bang sometimes, and that is important. And we're not anti that.
Sure.
But back to the story of just, we're so far, right of bang that, it's comical at times. And so now with Samdesk, what they had, and that happened twice. So we had a direct A/B comparison. The second time we were able to triage, notify up and down the command, entirely detect it, get in touch with Polish authorities. They confirmed it. And within an hour of the projectile landing on Polish soil, there is a coordinated press release to say, hey, this is not an escalation. It's a rogue missile. We are not going to be reading into it. And it actually goes directly to the narrative that, the West is disjointed. We're not coordinated. They're weak. No, it actually got directly to the face of that to say, no, we were aware. We saw what had happened. It's not an escalation. It's a minor issue. It's been dealt with within an hour. So there's no news cycle spiraling out of control. They're not escalating. It's not feeding into other disinformation campaigns that might be going on. And it stems from timely, credible information in the moment. And it's so that, that's a big scale international story. We could talk about, very local level stuff too, where they have those stories. But it is this weird cyclical nature that we live in where the promise of real-time information is the curse. And if you let the stuff spiral, it becomes such a huge problem from a PR perspective, from emergency managers. All of this stuff is kicking in, whether we like to acknowledge it or not. There will be conspiracy theories and rumors spinning up about what's actually happening. And there are adversaries that will seek to exploit that on from all over the place. And our emergency managers and a lot of our, leaders we're too slow to respond. And it's in that initial hour we say, hey, we do know what's going on. We've got first responders there. And so it's just really important to kind of tighten that narrative, that response. There's the physical response we can talk about too, but we've seen really good results with that now. And I think, that's what gets us excited, hearing stories like that, Zach, of like, okay, we went from like early days and like, how do we detect the news before the news to really supporting some really high stakes stuff. It's a simple notification. It's just a blip to say, hey, this is happening. Sure. But if it's right and it's accurate and it's timely, what you can do with that it's incredible.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll sort of like bring it back down to some of that local level, because I think with the thing that I'm kind of most excited about is there was like this period of time where, the prospects of this stuff, it was like we started out sort of as the technology democratized, right? Like Twitter was there, and, Facebook to a degree. There was, what was the other one? Yak was one that was like, in those early days. And you're starting to like get this stuff where you're like, oh, cool. Like I'm getting like geospatially, coordinated information here. So I can like, as a person, say, all these tweets are coming from like this region. We didn't fully understand like, the ability to spoof or, whatever else. And the intentional, we all sort of believed everyone was doing things in good spirits back then. But like, you're seeing this thing and you're like, all right, cool. Like I'm building a picture that, previously would take a military apparatus to sort of accomplish. And so I'm in the military as a reserve component. And I see intelligence documents and I see how long between when I get that initial notification and when the analysis is done and it's, been presented in a way that is, applicable. And it could take a really long time because there's a lot of different moving parts and stuff. And so when OSINT became much more, which is open source intelligence for the people who are not familiar, it became this thing where like it started to butt up against the professional intelligence community, right? And they are gatekeepers, like very much so. Like I've got friends that are definitely they're intel, officers, rightfully so. They work their asses off to get to where they are, and it's really hard to maintain your credibility in that. They are very precise in what they do, and you can confidently take the reports and understand that like this is the best work that could be done by a human being with the information that they have. But it's a different thing when it's a situation like I'm an emergency manager, again, in a rural place that doesn't have access to their, technology, their sources. And I'll give you the example 2 years ago when the first batch of those robocalls was going out to schools. And it was, a active shooter in a elementary school. And it was pretty realistic. They were using terms and names and stuff that sounded like it might actually be happening.
Right.
But it took 2 seconds for some dispatchers, not all, to go, that's weird. I'm only getting the single 911 call. And because of my experience, I know I should be getting lots of 911 calls. I know every teacher, every kid in that school has a cell phone and they'd be blowing me up right now. And I'm just getting, onesies, twosies from this unknown number that is spoofed. It doesn't come back to anyone. It's weird. So the ones that were able to sort of like distinguish that didn't create a big response. But what did happen in some communities was they rolled SWAT, they rolled EOD, they locked up the school for hours. Those kids were on lockdown thinking they're going to die, and they're hiding in their classrooms in the dark, peeing in buckets and stuff because, they don't know how long it's going to be, texting their parents goodbye, all of this stuff. When having that information, from a Samdesk, this is where like, I think the big picture stuff, like does Samdesk benefit the city of New York? Of course it does. But the city of New York can throw enough resources at a problem that they can figure it out with people, right? Like they can do that. The pieces that like I think are really important are those places where they don't have access to all the other stuff, where this information it makes a huge difference. So having access to that, where a dispatcher could look up on the screen, hey, I'm not getting anything else. Like we're now a couple minutes into this response. I've had one 911 call. I'm not getting the Samdesk notification. When we know any shooting, it is everywhere online instantly. It's that extra bit of information that now they go, hey, everyone, let's slow it down. Let's figure out if this is true. I'm going to call back the school before I send everyone and just see, hey, do you hear gunshots? Do you see anyone running through the halls? Like we got this one call. Let's clarify on it. No, nothing's going on. Awesome. We've prevented a massive headache. And in a couple of those scenarios, so post Uvalde, obviously, parents didn't trust cops for a while. Like they were really nervous that there wasn't going to be someone going in there. And so parents were showing up with guns when those notifications went out because they're like, I'm going to go get my kid and I'll stop this if I have to. There was a guy who got severely injured trying to climb through a window while police are trying to pull them back because the message went out. There's a school, the school's on lockdown, active shooter, right? They did the best tool that they had with the best information that they had. And this guy gets all cut up, gets arrested. Fortunately, they dropped the charges. There was another situation where the cop drove their cruiser through the front door because they were so worried about it. And they wanted to be there to make sure that they were saving the kids' lives, that they couldn't get, the key wasn't working or something. They didn't have access. So he drove his cruiser through the door. Now, mind you, what if there had been a kid on the other side of that or something?
Right.
So these really major responses to nothing. Yeah. And that's the area where I think it's also like, yes, these tools are great for when stuff is happening, but they're also great to like capture that moment, lower the temperature, and give you information where now you can make a good tactical and strategic decision on how you're going to respond to something.
I mean, I think it's the danger of single source anything, right?
Yeah.
And dispatch for lack, unfortunately, like it's a single source, right? You're relying on a single phone call at times, or maybe multiple calls, but it's a single modality, right? You've got a audio call that you're relying on. And so one of the things that we think about a lot too, right, is what's the credibility of that? Yeah. And it almost doesn't matter, kind of what modality you want to talk about, from spoofing phone calls, robocalls. We see thunderclaps on Twitter, bot farms. Big or small, right? And so we see that kind of activity all the time, originating from all kinds of different areas of the world, trying to you create real world events from physical things or from virtual things. They're trying to create physical real world events, right?
Yeah.
So single source is just I know we've all been taught this, but it's perilous, and I think dispatchers really struggle with that, right? Because they are told that they can trust the public, they can trust their sources of information when something's happening, and that's by and large usually okay, and it works, right? But it's not foolproof. And so I think, even local level dispatchers need to be armed with more data. It's nothing's ever impossible, but it's exponentially more difficult to spoof, swat somebody or do some sort of like, thing you're talking about, like with an active shooter situation.
Right, everything all at once. The social media aligned with the 911 calls, aligned with fake videos.
Look at traffic data. Look at traffic patterns. Look at different things, right? I mean, there's also other data sources that we can look at to get some sort of indication. Being like, I don't know. I mean, we're seeing this on maybe 2 platforms reporting this. It could be circular. Maybe somebody on a phone call triggered a Twitter thread saying that there is, and a Reddit thread. Like that happens, but you got to look at more data, and it's very rare, at least for those kind of large scale events, that it's happening in a vacuum, right? It lights it up across the board, and you can look at a lot of different data sources there. So, Paul Hildreth, he's the Fulton County School District, one of our power users, and it's cool talking to him about these kinds of stories of how they use Samdesk at Fulton County School District. It's a school level. How do we deal with things like school safety using a Samdesk with their other kinds of things, right? And this is a transition where Paul's team's a pioneer in the space, but kind of going through the access control, camera phases, metal detectors, kind of running the gambit of kind of security controls that they have tested and used to various different degrees. And it always comes back to it's, increasingly these days, it's often the things happening outside our 4 walls that we have no visibility in from these traditional systems that are, the biggest challenges, right? Climate, terrorism, those kinds of things are just so hard to predict, and they usually don't get reported in the typical way, right? So, I think that's it. Just bring more data to the party. It'll just always help you if you can, as long as you can deal with the noise problem, as long as you're not drowning your people to say, okay, more data to analyze on a human perspective. No, not necessarily, but AI thrives on more data. It can handle it. It can compute this stuff in seconds where we can't as humans. And it can just say, this pattern is on 3 platforms, not more, or we're seeing it across these departments. And in a lot of counties, the Samdesk system, has partnerships with scanners or, companies like Citizen that will sit in with police scanners and bring in that data. That's another data point that a dispatcher will say, okay, here we're seeing 911 calls, but no other indicator, to prove the credibility. So that's exciting. I think, that's where the promise of technology really kicks in, where it's actually a force multiplier, right? Okay, it's not taking your job and totally changing it where you have to learn a whole bunch of sets of new procedures, it slides properly and it does, hey, Zach, you would have had to have checked these 10 sources manually. I've done it for
the
you.
Seconds. Yeah. Right. As I'm dispatching, units, as I'm like trying to determine what additional resources that like we don't have in our immediate area. Like, I don't have an emergency or an explosive ordnance disposal team. So I got to go to this organization. Maybe it's a hazmat. And then there's like the things of like, what if the disaster spans a huge, multi jurisdictions, like, we're all operable and all this other stuff. It's not true. Like we, like trying to figure out what's going on in the city next to you can sometimes be like, you're talking a different language on a different planet. So, being able to sort of monitor things,
jurisdiction lines are very real, and you got to figure out who's doing what and where.
Just like with the storms that went through, Oklahoma and Nebraska and stuff, right? Like, you're watching the radar and stuff, but most of the, community that's interested in this stuff and is monitoring it, like they're on social media also sort of tracking that and, trying to figure out what is credible, like the classic, there's sharks swimming through the streets, every hurricane that comes out. Right. Yeah. And, people fall for it every single time. So I think there's so much value, I guess, like, to kind of wrap up the conversation, I'm curious about, what are you guys sort of thinking is next? Like, where does this sort of technology grow? Are there new markets you're trying to get into? Is there new stuff you're going to bring, to the table that, hasn't been done previously?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, I will say a big part of it is still, if I could plug anything or kind of think about it, I still think that most people are still very focused on, left to bang when they're so far right. There's still that gap. And I know it's kind of, maybe not the new sexy thing, but like so many teams are still there. So many teams are still really, really reactive. And I don't even have to get super, prescriptive and trying to get super clever about it. It's just like so many fusion centers, dispatchers, so many different folks that we talk to are just starting to look at this now, like just now trying to get a grip on it. So hopefully Samdesk can help. I know there's other tools out there. We try to, make sure we hit that signal to noise ratio. We try to make sure that we're providing, good signal there. But for us, I think, what's next is I think there's, a big focus now on analytics, that can really be derived from this, right? So one of the things that we've been building over this time is just a really, really robust crisis database. So we've been able to map, dumpster fires right through to large scale invasions. And what that gives you is a really interesting data set in of itself that we can really provide for a lot of, the planning phase as well. So that's where Samdesk is pushing a lot right now to say, okay, how can we analyze and compute this data around major events or trends that might not be immediately apparent?
Say trend analysis sounds like as far as sort of like I do a lot of AI and emergency management stuff, and the idea that like, again, let's talk about the storms moving across the country, right? Like seeing how things are getting worse and worse, right? The cascading impacts that like I may not realize are coming down the line. If you're getting that information early, that's where like, oh, I need to call this special team. I can get them on the road 2 hours before the event hits us because the radar lines up with, like you said, the traffic patterns and all this stuff is painting this picture that otherwise would not be done. Like, that's fascinating to me.
So we think about, the string of, rail issues we had last year, right? Yeah. And so you can think about a local operator where like you get a Samdesk alert that something's been derailed or there's a chemical spill. That can be super helpful. You need to respond. Isn't it more helpful to know that that's the third time that's happened across the country in that time frame?
Oh,
or
interesting.
What if it's the first? Or like, now we're struggling to be like, is Boeing, is that a situation or not? Is this routine? Are we just getting a media cycle where like we're thinking about it, so we're talking about it more? And is it really there? And I think that a lot of, putting the media narrative aside, a lot of our jobs is to understand fact of, how bad of a problem is this, if it is a problem at all, right? That's the hard part. So if you bring, the analysis components to it, that's what we're really looking at Samdesk right now of like, hey, there's actually, 3 emergency landings a day. That's completely routine. And that's not outside of the FAA's, guidelines. That's just within the standard. So you can talk about that and hype that up as a big deal, or you can look at it and say, hey, that's actually completely normal. And that's normal, activity that we will see with that. So we're moving in a direction where we're not trying to say, here's the problem. We're trying to understand how, is this actually an anomaly? Is this, a common occurrence? It will have an impact on our response, right? When we think
Sure.
about, gun violence in Chicago will be very, very different than gun violence in a particular, other city that's not normally used to seeing that. And it will dictate a better response in our view to say, hey, this is a rare event for you guys. This is not within the norm. So you might want to, like, again, Boston Marathon style, you really want to escalate this very quickly because this is not normal behavior, right?
Well, there's also so one of the most important things, I foot stomp this all the time, is that, none of your plans, none of your procedures and policies should be built in a vacuum, right? Like the goal should be that you're doing a good hazard vulnerability analysis, like you're understanding what your risks are, you're understanding what your threats are, and that you're trying to, map that in some way, like physically, like if you have a heat map that says, hey, all your bad stuff is happening in this like 4-block radius, like maybe that's where we put the attention for a little while and see if, is it a bunch of slip and fall injuries that are coming up on 911 calls, or is it a bunch of, drug dealing situations, or is it car accidents? When you're doing that stuff and you're putting your effort towards like, let's figure out what is that like common high probability, high consequence event. If you can figure that out and then you can mitigate it, through data, because now we know this is the worst intersection in Vermont, right? Or this is where all the hazmat spills have happened for the last, 10 years in our community. You could potentially eliminate that. And now it's not a threat anymore. It's not a hazard. So you move on and life is good. That's way better than responding to it later on where, someone's injured, someone's killed, you've poisoned the earth and now there's, you can't build or live there.
It's that whole, like, we talk about that graph, it's the, preparation, awareness, and like response and recovery and all that sort of stuff, right? It's just a shortening of that classic graph, right? I mean, it's just too long right now, right? Like when we think about the rail examples or there was a recurring issue, we see these stories all the time. Like, first of all, they didn't even know it was happening. Somebody's got to call it in. Somebody thought somebody else called it in. They didn't, So it like, come on, like it takes too long to be aware of these things. It should be front and center immediately. But then, it took too long, Zach, to understand it's beside a chemical plant. Yeah. Like that level of information on the GIS system, like all that sort of like correlation and causality. And we live in a world where that's not, we don't have to really tolerate that anymore. I don't think, Zach, it's like, that's open source data. We know that. We can look on Google, and that's the promise of AI. Just find me that correlation immediately, right? So tell me that problems happen. Tell me what other things I'm not thinking of. Right? Like I didn't know that was like a highly populated area, or it's a very quiet area. Maybe it's a highly populated area, but it's 10 o'clock at night and it's not a highly populated area, right? Like there's so many little like low hanging fruit from a data perspective that operators are just not aware of because they're busy. And I get it. Like that's where data should help them to be like, here's the full sit rep in the first 5 minutes. And here's the situational awareness and the contextual importance, infrastructure, utilities, schools, chemical plants within a 5-mile radius of the situation you might want to be aware of. That can be delivered in a second. Right. But that's hours of work if it ever happens, or so the
it doesn't happen. I promise
happens.
you it doesn't happen. We're so, especially, the weather and climate, response of in our country now, it's like we're under 24/7 response mode. Like it's so hard to do all the work that like I advocate for. And, especially for the like I said, the small agencies, right? The big agencies have the capacity and the resources to probably do a pretty good job at it. But there's all the communities across the country that all face, these hazards and threats. So trying to find ways to augment that and help those folks out so that they're not in response mode, right? We can start to chip away at these hazards and these threats, I think is going to make a huge difference. So I'm really excited about that. I think that's a good spot to end. We've got, all sorts of stuff. I've got a million more questions. So at some point I'd love to have you back on to chat more about this. And maybe we can do some like scenario work and try to talk through some things. And story time's always good. War stories are good. But I think this is also exciting because I think there's just a lot, there's a trust thing that there's two things that have to occur. They're both R&D, right? The first is retire and die. There's a lot of people who just refuse to accept new approaches to response and preparedness and recovery. And then there's the ripping off and duplicating, right? You still have a bunch of agencies that are innovators, right? The Fulton County Schools, that's an innovator. There's someone who's out in front of where most schools are. And innovators are taking on the liability and they're taking on the costs, right? They're spending money on the technology to sort of get out ahead. As that starts to get established and there's a trust level, now other schools go, okay, it's not a risk for me anymore. Like this is an investment that I know is going to pay back really quickly. And I'm going to call up my buddy, who runs the Fulton County Schools, security and safety department. And they're going to say, get Samdesk. And then the district next to me is going to say, well, they just got it. We should get it. Right. And then now you have that proliferation of this stuff. And I think that's like where we're kind of at now. This is not new technology. It's been around now for 13 years. And so now it's just sort of like, we have to get to that point now where people start to recognize it. I think the acceptance of AI, the millennials, I'm an elder millennial or geriatric millennial is what I've been referred to, which is the most disgusting term on earth. It makes me so mad. But, we're the transition generation, so I think as we come in, the people behind us are smarter and more tech savvy and more used to it. It's going to get better and better. And so I'm excited for it. And I really appreciate you coming in and sort of giving us that background, because I think all of that information is going to help everyone, whether you're, the Luddite who still does all your stuff on paper, or you're that brand new, emergency manager, intelligence analyst, police officer, who's just eating this stuff up and wants to implement it on their department, maybe doesn't know how to justify it. Like there's a bunch of stuff in this episode that like you can take and say, hey, it's not new technology. It's been used for these incidents. Here's some background on it. So I guess what's the best way for people to sort of like learn more about you guys? Do you do webinars or anything like that?
We do a host of webinars. The team is really busy on socials, and you can all find those on www.samdesk.io is our homepage. So start there and branch off and follow along or get in touch. Man, it's time. I don't think we can kind of tolerate anymore. I mean, whether it's, Samdesk or other technologies, there's so many out there. And like the sooner we respond, the safer our communities are going to be, hands down.
Awesome. I appreciate it. And
thanks for having me, Zach.
Like I said, I can't wait to talk again in the future.
Let's do the scenarios. We'll get more tactical.
We're gonna man, we'll do so much fun stuff. I'm excited. So, if you like this episode, please share it. I will post a bunch. I'll take all the stuff that James just said, also put it in the show notes so that you can find them easily enough. And thanks again, James.
Thanks for having me, Zach. Had a blast.